The rising cost of attending college is a significant concern for many students and their families, and it can have a major impact on their decision to enroll in higher education. So, what does the rise entail for the students in the country as a whole? Hello, my name is Shashank, and I, along with my teammate Ethan, set out on a journey to explore the repercussions of the same. We started with 3 questions in our mind. Firstly, how has the changing price of tuition affected the number of college-educated people in the state and the country at large? Does the tuition cost of states affect its percentage of citizens that are college-educated in relation to other states? And lastly, does tuition cost play an impact on the number of college students that attend but fail to graduate? Interestingly, our findings differed significantly from what we initially anticipated. Across states, over the years, there seems no correlation between lower enrollment and higher cost of tuition. Surprisingly, states with higher average tuition had a higher proportion of population that was college educated. Also, fewer students dropped out of colleges that had higher average tuition. To back our findings, we relied on credible data sources. So we took undergrad enrollment and tuition data set from Kaggle, monthly consumer price index from US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and educational attainment stats from US Census Bureau. We leveraged Google Colab environment to do the EDA on previously mentioned datasets, and a few trends and peculiar things straight away caught our eyes. As you could see on the chart, that average tuition as well as room and boarding cost has increased steadily year over year across different institutions types. The rising cost has been more steep for private institutions versus public institutions. We came across a peculiar thing in this heat map. It is a general misconception that private institutions always tend to have higher tuition than public in-state and public out-of-state colleges. But in this heat map, there have been several states, for instance, Arizona, Delaware, etc., where the public out-of-state colleges on an average tend to have higher tuitions. Also, among the states, there seemed to be a high variation when it comes to undergrad tuition. Now addressing the question, how has the rise in tuition costs impacted college enrollment? As you can see on the chart, x-axis represents the inflation-adjusted tuition with percentage changes, and the y-axis represents the enrollment changes, and the circles on the chart represent states. What does this translate to? Is that year over year, with steady increase in tuition, enrollment remains steady across states. And there is no correlation between rising tuition and increased decrease in enrollment. Few circles at the bottom represent year 2020, where we did not have enough enrollment stats.
The next question we wanted to look into was, do states with higher tuition rates actually have lower percent of citizens that are graduates? And surprisingly, the answer to that question is no. A state having higher tuition rates is actually associated with a higher percentage of its citizens that are college graduates. You can see the chart on the left here. The x-axis, we have tuition, and the y is the percentage of citizens in a state that is graduated college. So this shows each state from 2013 until present, and you can see it is very strongly positively correlated where higher tuition is a higher percentage of graduates. So the results of this question surprised us. We wanted to figure out, why would a state with higher tuition have more college graduates? One thing that we thought is that if a state's median earnings were higher, then perhaps that would explain why there were more college graduates in that state. So this graph we see on the right here shows the same as before. It shows tuition on the x-axis and the percentage of citizen graduates on the y. And the color of these dots actually represents the bin that state's median earnings falls into, with low being the lowest 25%, low med being the next 25%, and so on. And while there is seems to be a very weak correlation to where states with higher tuition and higher college graduate ratios may get slightly higher earnings, it's not strongly enough to actually explain this phenomenon that we saw. So the question remains, why would higher tuition mean more college graduates? Well, unfortunately, we didn't have the data in what we had collected to prove this, but there are a couple of theories as to why this might be the case. First of all, if a state pours more financial resources into that state's education, it'll have nicer facilities and higher quality education, and as such will charge more for that education. If an education in a certain state is considered higher standard than others, then people will likely move there to receive that finer education, thus inflating the number of graduates. Second, there's the perceived value of education. If a certain state perceives the value of college education to be higher than others, then it makes sense that that state's culture would result in a higher concentration of degreed citizens. And last, there's the idea of demand and supply. If a state is larger and has more students that wish to go and want to graduate, then it's likely that they will be able to charge more as such to provide to those students. And the last question we examined in this project was if states with higher tuition rates have higher dropout rates. And once again, the answer to our question was actually the opposite of what we expected. Surprisingly, higher tuition rates were actually associated with lower dropout rates. So in this graph, you can see tuition on the x-axis and the dropout rate on the y. Each dot is a state in a particular year, and you can see that as tuition increases, the percentage of students that drop out actually falls in general. And here, just to take a closer look, we can see how tuition varies against dropout rates just in 2021. One thing you can notice is that as tuition rises, it seems that the variance within each tuition bin actually rises as well. So there's a lot more variance with high tuition schools in terms of dropout rate than there is in lower ones. But that being said, there's still definitely a negative correlation between the two variables. Now, why would higher tuition rates mean lower dropout rates for that state? There's three potential situations that could explain this. First of all is that if a student invests a lot of money into their education, they would be higher motivated to graduate and be able to recoup that investment, maybe pay back student loans that they took out in order to graduate. Second, there could be a sunk cost fallacy, where somebody invests a lot of money into something, then they feel like they need to finish that said thing just because there was money invested into it. And last, it could just be that that specific state that has a higher tuition is more education focused. Like once again, they could just have nicer facilities and such lower dropout rates. So overall, from our research, the major takeaway we can get is that rising tuition costs in the United States over the last 10, 15 years has not had negative effects that a lot of people initially think. As we saw throughout our presentation, rising tuition has not negatively affected enrollment. It has not negatively affected the distribution of citizens with degrees between states, and it has not had a negative effect on dropout rates. Now, it's important to note that just because rising tuition means lower dropout rates, that does not mean that rising tuition causes lower dropout rates. There's likely additional factors between each state and within the world that is actually causing what we see to occur.